Hi and welcome to this video. Today we are heading to Kenilworth. Kenilworth is southwest of Coventry in the Midlands, just southeast of Birmingham, and we are going to visit the amazing Kenilworth Castle. So let's go and take a look. So the first tantalising view you get of the castle is after you've parked your car and you got out and you can see it through the hedge, and it looks fantastic. And this walk up to it that you can see here is the original approach. This is how it would have been back when it was originally built. And right here there would have been a gatehouse with a portcullis. And of course it would have looked far more spectacular in its prime and not like the ruin it is today. The gatehouse actually had a name. It was called Mortimer's Tower, named after Roger Mortimer, who hosted a tournament back in the 1200s. But as you can see, like all the castles that we visit and the rest of this castle, it was demolished in 1650 after the Civil War. It wasn't fully demolished; it was just disabled as a battlement, basically. Here you can see the portcullis groove. I should have got a close-up of this, but I didn't. But I thought I'd pause it. And this is where a portcullis used to be, and above it used to be a room where they would sort of wind it up and down. And yeah, it was a lot more enclosed than what it is today. But that's pretty cool to see the actual portcullis groove there now. But you can see there's still bits of it left, and they had defense in their minds all the time. So you can see the arrow slits they would have used if they got invaded. There would have been occupants in these little places here and at the tower, sort of keeping guard. In here there is a guard's room, and there would have been a little fire in here to keep them warm. Believe me, you would have needed back in the day, because there was no other source of heating. And so having a nice toasty fire there would have been pretty awesome. And keeping the guard warm while he kept a watch, kept a lookout for any invaders. Okay, so as you walk through the gatehouse and you enter the grounds, you get this sight. Which is quite spectacular when you first see it. So on the left is Leicester's building, that's what it's called, and there on the right is the Great Tower. But let me pause it there for a moment and show you roughly what it used to look like. It did not look like this, all open as you see it now, with Leicester building on the left and the Great Tower on the right, and it being open so you could walk in. It wasn't like that. It was more like this. I'm sorry for the crude mock-up, but I just sort of like put it together to give you an idea of what it was like. The inner court, which would have been behind that central wall there, was blocked off. You wouldn't have been able to walk in there. The only way in would have been through the doorway at that bottom of that small tower there next to the Great Tower. And when the Queen visited, which we'll get into later, she would have walked through that door. And so if you could see a ghost of her now walking into the castle, she would have gone through that door. But there was a path there which was adorned with big ornaments and statues and things, and even a bridge which sort of traversed a dry dip in the land that was there. So it was very different pre 1650. And that was part of the demolition to get rid of that wall, to open it all up so that they, if they used it in battle again, then they could easily just go in. But it was, you can probably tell I get really angry. Whoever was responsible for ordering all these castles to be demolished needs to be held accountable, because it was a travesty, a big mistake. But anyway, we are where we are, and this is how it would have looked roughly. It would have been a lot more pristine, a lot cleaner. It wouldn't have been wrecked like it is now. You can see on the Great Tower at the top there would have been a clock on either side, and you can even see the holes where it was fitted, and then the mechanisms for making the clock work came through the wall are still there. You can see that. So that's really cool. Okay, so let's move forward. We're going to start with the Leicester building. We're going to walk around this and go inside it and investigate that first, and then we're going to make our way around the castle and end up at the Great Tower over here. So let's go. So around the whole estate of this castle there is a curtain wall. Like a lot of castles have curtain walls, and we've seen them in the other videos. And this one again had defence, arrow slits in all the walls, just to keep any invaders at bay. Leicester's building wasn't built until the 1570s. It was built by Robert Dudley, who was the Earl of Leicester, hence the name of the building. But the Leicester building was really impressive. It was like 4 stories high, and it was extended and built specifically for the Queen's visit in the 1570s. She came to stay. And here you can see the floors of the buildings, and the Queen would have stayed in one of these apartments. I think it was the second floor. The ground floor and the first floor were not the principal quarters. They were, because the building was on a slope, they were kind of like the basement and the sort of working part of the building, and then the apartments would have been the sort of second and the third floor. And you can see them here in this image. Very impressive. We'll be going up there shortly, so you can see how high up it was. It's actually quite amazing. So much destruction, not a lot left. I mean, to be fair, it did decay over time as well. There is a lot of decay here, not just destruction. To build one of these must have cost an absolute fortune, and to rebuild it today would be billions. I'm pretty sure of it. So here we go into the inside at the basement, and we can look up the several floors here, or what would have been. Obviously we wouldn't have been able to do this back in the day, but you can see where all the floors were. You can see the holes in the walls where the beams would have been extended, when the floor, and the fireplace is up in the wall, which is just the most bizarre thing. You've seen a fireplace high up in a wall, but obviously there would have been a floor there, and that would have been used, and big windows, just so impressive back in the day. You can see why the sort of Queen was drawn to this place, and it was actually compared a lot to Windsor Castle, which we'll visit at some point, I'm sure, and it will appear on this channel. Obviously the wooden beams would have rotted and fallen out, and it's very sad. You do really feel the presence of people who once lived in these places. It's quite the bizarre thing until you're standing there and you're looking and walking around. It's really hard to. On the image, it just looks like a rotten old building, but you know, it has a lot of meaning, a lot going on, a lot of history, a lot of. If the wars could speak, it'd be pretty amazing. We were marvelling at the architecture, not the architecture, but how it was built. You know, you've got to remember, back in the 1500s, they didn't have the machinery we had today. They didn't have big cranes to lift, you know, rocks up and stuff. And this was amazing. And they had they used similar techniques to we use today, and like they put plinths over the windows and things like that. You can see them still exist in places. One thing that's really evident is the markings on the walls. There's a lot of graffiti, especially by those pesky Victorians, and I'll do a little section on the graffiti a bit later. But you can see markings like that. That's kind of weird. It's like, why is that there even? Lots of questions. You get more questions walking around these buildings than you do answers. There's another fireplace, which would have been in one of the chambers above. The Queen may have stood in front of that fire at one point to stay warm. You never know. And with each floor above, there's more fireplaces. So she would have certainly, she definitely stayed in this building. It is recorded that she did stay here, and because it was built for her when she visited. To stand and to be where Queen Elizabeth I once stood, and you know it for certain, is quite the more remarkable thing. It's like, wow, because she was a popular queen back in the day, and she reigned for a long time, a bit like our current Queen Elizabeth, and she did a great job as well. She never married, she never had children, which caused the problems when she died, but I think Robert Dudley was something to do with that. But there we go. You can see more fireplaces up there. You can even see that the pillars on the sides. Look at the detail in some of these things. They would have looked amazing. You can see these patches of plaster on the wall, and there is recordings that most castles were actually plastered on the inside. And even though we're seeing all the brick and the stone outside now, it wouldn't have been like that. It would have been plastered on the inside, and all the holes you see in all the walls were where drapes would have fallen. The walls would have been covered with drapes, and lots of images and cloth, and it would have looked fantastic. Okay, so now we head up the stairs to the Queen's bedchamber and the Queen's outer chamber. Robert Dudley must have been besotted with the Queen. He built such an amazing building just for her visit. For her 19-day visit, he built this whole structure, and it is almost like a monument to Queen Elizabeth I. But the thing is, I don't think it was reciprocated in any way. She did stay here for 19 days, and Robert Dudley, tried and hoped to propose to the Queen, but obviously that didn't work out, as we know. But I think this was more of a getaway. It was more of a holiday for the Queen, almost. You got to remember who she was. She was the last of the Tudor house, and her father was Henry VIII. That in itself, living with that, is going to be quite heavy on your shoulders. He was probably the most famous king to ever live. At the time she came here, the Spanish Armada was starting to bubble up, and Mary Queen of Scots was plotting to assassinate her with her eventual beheading, which had a massive impact on the Queen, and she tried to stop it from happening, but it was the law at the time and was taken out of her hands. And these are just the things we know about. So, everywhere she went, men would be throwing themselves at her feet, and she had quite a turbulent life, if you ask me. Her head was full of all this stuff, and it could potentially be why she didn't marry. Perhaps she didn't trust any man after her father did that to all his wives, including her mother. And I think this place is very impressive. but I think it was, for her, it was a getaway. I mean, here they are. This is a picture of Robert Dudley and a picture of the Queen drawn around the time they came here, with the aim of it being turned into paintings of them both to be hung on the walls, but that never came to fruition. But still, you can see the Queen was, he literally drew them as he saw them, and you can see the Queen was young still looking, and you can see why Robert Dudley and probably half the male population was throwing themselves at the Queen at the time. I mean, the Queen had fun when she came here. Shows were put on and spectacles were put on. I mean, in the floor above there was some dancers taking place when she should have been looking out over a court to watch a play. She was instead distracted by these delectable dancers, and she missed the whole play, so they had to restage it for her 3 days later so she could watch it again. So she was distracted by many things. I don't think Robert Dudley stood a chance, even though he tried his hardest, and I'll explain some more of that when we get to his Gatehouse a bit later on. So the next part of the building was the State Apartments. This was developed long before Leicester's building for the Queen. It was developed in the 1300s by John Gaunt. John Gaunt was the son of King Edward III, and he is said to have made it into a really nice palace, if you like. There's not a lot left of it today, but what there is you can see here, and it's still quite fascinating walking around and looking at the place, and you can kind of get a feel of how they used to live. Here we have the Great Hall, which was an absolute architectural masterpiece. It's still part of the John Gaunt structures that were built when he was around in the 1300s. But what's interesting about this place is that the Great Hall was not on the ground. Like, we're walking now on the ground, but we're walking in the basement. The actual floor of the Great Hall was on floor 1, and you can see the fireplace up there next to the windows, and so the floor would have been level with the fireplace and the base of the windows all around, and then holding it up would have been like a rows of pillars holding it up, holding the floor up basically. And it was a bit of a masterpiece. The architecture and the detail around this place, you can see, is pretty phenomenal. I think in the glory days, when it was like pristine, it would have looked magnificent. And here you can see what's left of the pillars that used to hold the floor up. But it's better viewed from above. You can see from up here how grand it would have been, and it would have been quite large as well, and tall, with a great big roof, and yeah, it would have looked really, really grand. Amazing place. So much detail, massive tall windows, and yeah, it would have been quite the spectacle to see it in its heyday. Next up is the kitchens, and kitchens were enormous. It's part of the John Gaunt building as well, although they believe he extended it from earlier days. back in the 1200s. And you can see the hearths of 3 enormous fireplaces still exist, which is pretty spectacular to see. And then in the centre there you can see the right hand wall, and between the right hand wall and the left hand wall you can see like a channel down the middle for drainage, for waste to run away. And there you can see some of the hearths. And also here you can see the remainder of a tile. So they used to have elaborate tiles in the kitchen, which I found really fascinating. And that's the only piece I could find, so it's really cool that it still remains. Now, and then down the other end of the kitchen is the storage room, which had this amazing roof. How it's still standing after all this time, I have no idea, because it looks pretty special the way it was built. This arched roof there, and with this sort of spiderweb structure that's holding it up, which is pretty amazing. I don't know how that's still up in the air, which is pretty cool. But there we go, it is. And this is where they used to store grain and everything they used to cook. All the meat used to hang in it. It used to be pretty cool, I'd imagine, because it was quite cool when we walked in there, even though it was a winter's day. But it would have been still quite cool, because it was slightly below ground, and you had to go down into the rooms to get into here. And this block on the ground, I'm not quite sure what this is, but it was just left here. It might have been a grindstone or something. It's got like you'll see it as I turn, there's like a groove or a scratch up the centre of it, so I don't know quite what it was used for. There was no reference for it or anything, so that's quite interesting nonetheless. Now we move on to this formidable structure, which is the Norman Keep. This is the earliest part of the castle, and this takes us back to the 1120s, when the oldest part of the structure was built. That's 900 years, almost to the year. That's incredible. That's so old. It's almost unbelievable that something standing is 900 years old. It's amazing. I know there's older things in the world, but when you see these buildings, it's just your mind is just blown. It's quite incredible. But this building was poked at and prodded at and built on for generations, including King John in 1210 had a go at it. John Gaunt in the late 1300s had another bash at it and added bits and pieces, and all the way up to Robert Dudley in the 1500s, when he made modifications for the Queen's visit in 1570. So it's had a lot of modifications and updates since its original conception, and you can see the different style in architecture and things like this that were added to it over the years. But still a formidable structure, and it would have been difficult to get into this part of the building. The walls were so thick. They were 14 feet thick. And you see, as we go through this arch on the left there, you can see where the wall was demolished, and it was under these arches, and right there down the left hand side of that building where the wall was, 14 feet. Amazing. This last building is called Leicester's Gatehouse. This was built by Robert Dudley, and it was built in the 1570s specifically for him, and to create a new entrance to the castle, a more grand and more impressive entrance than the older one that we saw at the beginning of this video. It didn't always belong to him. After the Civil War, it was taken over by some military person, which I won't go into details. The inside has been kept roughly as it was, pretty much, back in that day. I think over the time some modifications have been done, but generally speaking, this is what it is, and it's turned into a sort of a museum of artifacts they found in the castle. And on the second floor there's like a history of Robert Dudley and his relationship with the Queen and what happened during that time, which is really interesting, but they wouldn't let me film it, so I could not show it here. But I highly recommend you go there. If you're going to this castle, go to this gatehouse and go to the second floor and just read the story. It's quite an interesting story between Queen Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, and it reveals some interesting facts, amongst many where Robert Dudley's wife was found dead at one point. Nobody could explain how she died or who did it, but conveniently for Robert Dudley, she was found dead, and that freed him up essentially to marry the Queen. But it never came, as we said before, that never came to fruition. If he murdered her, which nobody knows if he did or not, I'm not saying he did, then it was a fruitless endeavour. So, but fascinating. I'm not convinced that, I know in history they say Robert Dudley was a suitor for Queen Elizabeth I, and that she one of his favourites and all this. I'm not convinced. This, if you go on to Wikipedia, I'll put the link in the description below, and read about him. He was a little bit of a shady character, and she didn't marry him in the end, so that tells you a lot. To start with, in 1554, he was condemned to death. I'm not sure what the crime was, but he was released in 54 after he took part in a battle, and he was sort of like freed basically from that. Then his wife mysteriously died, which is a bit shady to say the least. He had a lot of fingers and a lot of pies. He was the biggest landowner in North Wales and England Midlands, West Midlands. He was quite wealthy. He refused to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, which I don't know. That in itself could have been friction there. And he was one of the main backers, financial backers, probably to Francis Drake, who was the guy who sailed around the world and helped defeat the Spanish in the Spanish Armada. even though the Queen actually came to this place 3 times, the main one being the big 19-day visit, but I'm not 100% sure that he's a good person, quite frankly. This fireplace was actually taken from the Queen's apartments that Dudley built for her and brought over here much later in 1650, after the Civil War, to preserve it and to put it into this building. And this is probably a fireplace that Queen Elizabeth touched, let alone stood in front of. She probably touched this. And you can see Leicester's, or I should say Robert Dudley's, initials and date carved onto this. The RL stands for Robert of Leicester, Robert Dudley of Leicester, RL, and you can see the date as well. So interesting stuff, and it's amazing detail that's gone into this. Phenomenal. Must have taken years just to create one, let alone all the others that were created for the Queen's apartments. Amazing stuff, incredible to witness and to look at, stand in front of. But if you want to learn more about him and more of his life, because then you can understand how Queen Elizabeth the First thought of him, perhaps. Then go on to Wikipedia. There's a whole page dedicated to him and his life and the things he did throughout his life, the things he was associated with, and and you can learn a bit about his wife, and it's quite an interesting read. Amy Dudley, that's what she was called. I mean, he was married to her, but he rarely spent time with her, apparently. But she died mysteriously in 1560. So, nice timing. I think it is rumoured that he was visiting Queen Elizabeth when it happened. Whether he ordered somebody to do it or what, I don't know. But it happened, and that sort of freed him up, if you like. Or in his mind, it probably did. Okay, that's it for Kenilworth Castle. I'm going to show you now some extra footage from the Elizabethan garden and some graffiti, like I promised at the start, which is really interesting, and you can see the dates on that, which are fascinating, because it shows the Victorians, when they came here to visit like we do today, they graffitied on the walls. But you can see the graffiti is quite elaborate in some places, so they spent time doing that. And it's really interesting. So I highly recommend you come here for a visit. And I've scratched the surface. You really should visit the place to get a full appreciation of what this place is and what it was and what it went through time, through 900 years of history, because it's had some really important people coming here, kings and queens, really important queens who ruled the country, and a lot of stuff happened here. So I really recommend it, and English Heritage do a great job of looking after this place. And so that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye for now. Hello, buddy.